Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. Welcome to folks who are entering the webinar. My name is Ann Baskerville, and on behalf of the Coalition to Stop CO2 Pipelines, welcome to our webinar, and thank you for taking the time to join us tonight. Wolf Carbon Solutions and ADM have plans to construct a 280-mile pipeline, the Mt.Simon hub, that will carry CO2 through 10 counties in West and Central Illinois. This pipeline is a for-profit project, subsidized by federal tax credits, that could have serious implications for the public safety, land use, property rights, and our environment. This webinar will help you better understand how a CO2 pipeline is different from an oil or gas pipeline, and how a CO2 pipeline could impact you and your community. You will hear from a variety of speakers tonight. Lan Richard from the Eco-Justice Collaborative will share a project overview and some key insights on why this proposal is happening now. Steve, a farmer from McDonough County, will share information related to the many ways CO2 pipelines can impact farmland and farming operations. Next, Kathy will share her perspective as a residential landowner living near a proposed CO2 pipeline route. Kathy will share insights from her research into the safety implications of living near a CO2 pipeline. Joyce will discuss the proposed lateral to the BioUrgia plant in Peoria. Our final speaker will be Pam, who will discuss the Illinois Commerce Commission process related to CO2 pipelines. Finally, and welcome everyone, I just wanted to say a quick note about the Q&A. In the bottom of your Zoom screen, you'll see two text message symbols and a Q&A. If you have a question, please type it in the Q&A section, and then we will get to questions, and our panelists will be happy to answer some of those questions after everyone has given their presentation. So the chat won't be where we keep questions. We'll keep questions in the Q&A. And once again, thank you everyone so much for joining us tonight. And now we will go to our first speaker, Lan Richard.
Thank you, Ann, and good evening, everyone. My name is Lan Richard. I'm the co-director of the Eco-Justice Collaborative in Champaign, Illinois, and also a member of the Coalition to Stop CO2 Pipelines. I want to begin with some basics on CO2 pipelines. For most of us in the Midwest, the concept of a CO2 pipeline is pretty new. Even now, as we have two major pipelines, CO2 pipelines proposed for Illinois, and probably others coming, many folks are still unfamiliar with the concept and what this could mean for our families and our communities. There's a lot to learn. I want to start out with some basics. What are CO2 pipelines? How are they different from the pipelines that we've lived with for generations, the oil and gas, et cetera? And what do we need to know? There's a lot more information on the Coalition website, noillinoisco2pipelines.org, and I encourage you to take advantage of those resources and share it with your friends and neighbors and colleagues. So what is a CO2 pipeline? It's really one of the three essential components of a system called carbon capture and storage, or in some cases, carbon capture and utilization. All three parts must be present for the system to be operational. Begins with a capture, an extensive system that takes a CO2 waste stream and from an industrial source, generally removes the water and impurities as much as possible, and then pressurizes that CO2 so it becomes a liquid. And this is then transported, and this is where the pipeline comes in. It's transported as a liquid to a designated location, injected deep underground, often as a in a geological formation, or it's in terms of utilization, it could be used to create carbon-based products, or what it's been most used for historically is underground, to facilitate the recovery of oil. So tonight we're going to focus solely on the pipelines. As Ann said, Wolf Carbon Solutions and ADM are proposing a 280-mile CO2 pipeline called the Mt.Simon Hub. It's 190 miles in Illinois. It will be about 16 inches in diameter. So far, Wolf ADM has provided very little information and just a very small generalized map showing a wide corridor. We do know that the pipeline would cross the Mississippi just north of the Quad Cities, head southeast towards Peoria, and cross the river south of Peoria near Pekin, Illinois. Just west of the Illinois River, there's a lateral pipeline, as you can see. It will head north or northeast to serve the Biourgia refinery in Peoria. This passes immediately adjacent to a high population area and low income neighborhoods. And this is going to be an issue that is problematic, really, because of the high density of people and the low income. From Peoria to the trunk line heads southeast to a sequestration site, which we believe will be near Decatur and near the plant, ADM plant. Wolf has noted that it will eventually connect to clients throughout the Midwest and the Ohio River Valley. If things go as they plan, the multiple phases will add additional clients in the power and industrial sector. And the plan is to pump ultimately 12 million tons of CO2 into the ground each year. Current operations at ADM has stored only 3.5 million tons over 11 years. This is about averages out to a third of a ton per year. A very different scale, 40 times the current rate. One of the biggest concerns about CO2 pipelines is its safety. And you will hear a lot of marketing messages from pipeline proponents that say it's the air we breathe, it's what plants use to grow, it's all around us. And this one, comes from Navigator. They have a very good marketer. It's the fizz in your soda. So it must be very safe. What I want to show you now is a video that's produced by a company called DNV. DNV is a Norwegian industrial testing and safety management company. And this video shows a rupture created for research purposes. So you'll note that this is an 8-inch pipeline. The main line of the Wolf pipeline will be 16 inches, which means it will contain about 4 times the volume of gas per unit of length. As you can see, CO2 pipelines are very different from oil and gas. At normal temperature and pressure, CO2 is a gas. For efficient transportation, it's compressed into a liquid at about 1,300 to 2,100 pounds per square inch. For comparison, a natural gas transmission line typically runs about 500 to 1,400. The transport process is really sensitive to contaminants, and in particular, small amounts of water can combine with CO2 to produce carbonic acid, which is very corrosive to the steel pipes that transport the gas, or the liquid rather. In a rupture, it explodes into a very high volume, extremely cold gas, somewhere around minus 109 degrees Fahrenheit. With a rupture, there's a rapid release of pressure, an abrupt phase change, and the temperature drop. And this can cause what's called a running ductile fracture. The pipe basically unzips, releasing a large volume of gas in a very short time. And there are shutoff valves spaced along the length of CO2 pipelines. They are miles apart, not feet apart. There's a maximum of 15 miles in high consequence areas, and that's where there's great concentration or great consequences to health and safety if there were an accident. The maximum is 20 miles in non-high consequence areas. But even if the shutoff valves work successfully, all of the CO2 between the valves escapes, and it can travel at great distances. It's heavier than air and acts as an asphyxiant. The pipelines coming to the Midwest are really ushering in a whole new era. Presently, there are about 5,100 miles in the US. Most are relatively short sections. All but one are connect capture facilities to oil fields where CO2 is used for enhanced oil recovery. In December of 2020, Princeton University and the Andlinger Center for Energy and Environment published a study. They showed a national plan for achieving net zero carbon emissions by 2050. And the study projected a need for 70,000 new miles of CO2 pipelines with major hubs in Illinois. And so with a massive tax credits now available through the Inflation Reduction Act, we're likely to see many more pipeline proposals. So the logical question is, who regulates CO2 pipelines? Pipeline companies will tell you they intend to comply with all state and federal pipeline regulations and that they're very rigorous. The three primary agencies you might expect to regulate CO2. First is FERC, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. But FERC has declared that it has no jurisdiction over CO2 pipelines. The Illinois Commerce Commission, state agency, approves the route alignment. They can issue a certificate of authority allowing the company to use eminent domain, but they don't regulate pipeline design or construction. That leaves PHMSA, or the Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration. They set standards for the design, construction, and operation and maintenance of CO2 pipelines, but their standards were originally developed for oil and gas. It was in the 1980s that Congress required PHMSA to add CO2 pipelines to their regs, which they basically just inserted after oil and gas. They don't address the unique characteristics of CO2 pipelines. And in fact, following a major pipeline disaster, which you'll hear a little bit more about later in this webinar, occurred in Mississippi in February 2020. And after investigating, PHMSA announced that it's taking steps to implement new measures to strengthen its safety oversight of CO2 pipelines and protect communities from dangerous pipeline failures. Needless to say, pipeline companies don't want to wait for the updated regulations. We think there are many reasons to give additional scrutiny to the onslaught of pipeline projects being proposed. There are concerns over private companies using eminent domain for their projects, concerns over farm impacts. The construction of the pipelines lead to the mixing of soils, the compaction of soils, severance of drainage tiles, and ultimately the loss of crop production. There's also the issue of long-term liability for both landowners and taxpayers, the state of Illinois. And a big one, the use of taxpayer money to subsidize a massive infrastructure and build out that's really a windfall profit for private investors. So we think that it's important before this infrastructure is approved at any level that we take the time to understand what is really being proposed. Is it necessary? Is it the best use of resources? What are the short and long-term impacts? And is it in the best interest of our families, our communities, or society at large? Or is it primarily a vehicle for serving special interests? This is a multi-generational commitment. And once this train rolls, there's no stopping it. So next up is going to be Kathy Campbell, a local landowner, to talk about safety concerns.
Hi, I'm Kathy Campbell, and I'm Vice President of Citizens Against the Heartland Greenway Pipeline. This is my backyard, which I dearly love, my favorite place on earth. And when I got my packet from Navigator, I really didn't know a lot about CO2 pipelines. I'm a scientist and a professor by training. I'm retired, so I started doing some homework. So this is for the Navigator Heartland Greenway Pipeline. And I want to show you, you saw the video of the rupture. This is how close they are to my house. And you will note that I am in a subdivision. I'm in a housing area. This is not a remote rural resident. And we are only 2,000 feet away, or actually just a little less. And that's after they moved the route after some complaints here. But this is actually frightening. The other thing is, if you look at the population density around here, that extends on the east side, that goes all the way to I-55. Little town of Glenarb is actually even closer to the pipeline than we are. And I want to talk a little about EMS, because since gas-powered engines will not work in the presence of CO2, how can EMS possibly save this many people in the event of a rupture? So EMS will not be able to rescue us. We already have our EMS services along the pipeline some say that they simply will not respond. It's too dangerous for their workers and they're not equipped to do it. But in our area, even if they could respond to try to rescue over 200 houses at once, is absolutely ridiculous. It's not going to be able to happen. So we're only going to have minutes before the freezing high pressure plumes overcomes, asphyxiates, possibly freezes us. So an alarm and leak detector system can't really save us because it won't give us enough lead time. And most people out here don't have all electric cars, so their gas powered engines simply won't work for escape either. EMS workers will not be able to reach us that quickly if they choose to respond. In some areas along the pipeline, they're saying that they won't. And they don't have the electric vehicles, personnel, and oxygen mask to immediately rescue multiple households at once. And right now, there seems to be no plans by Navigator to provide them. At least they have not said that. And even if they did, if all those people were sitting in electric vehicles ready to go at the time of a rupture for the multiple households here at once, they still would not be able to save us all. The other thing is CO2 can cause disorientation. It causes seizures. You can be comatose. You can be foaming at the mouth. You can lose your vision and hearing first. So the idea that you're going to be able to evacuate yourself or even wait until EMS arrives is highly improbable. So the risk of high-level CO2 and the CO2 in pipeline is almost pure CO2. It's an asphyxiant and it's a toxin. So to transport it, as Lan said, it's compressed into a liquid at very high pressure. It's also a powerful solvent, sensitive to pollutants. Anybody that's put a Mento in a bottle of Coca-Cola knows how a pollutant or particulate matter can cause it to rupture. If pressure is released, it explodes, as you saw in the rupture video. So don't believe it if, as the Navigator tried to tell us here, it's the fizz in your soda, but also they said, oh, it's just like a CO2 fire extinguisher. No, it isn't. It behaves at high volume very differently than at low volume. So it's not combustible, but it is highly explosive. And on this pipeline, as in the one proposed on the Wolf pipeline, there's multiple pickup points going on and off, so it can cause pressure fluctuations. And if exposed to water, it forms carbonic acid. That's an issue for corroding the pipelines. It's also an issue what happens to be raining when the CO2 comes through. So what happened in Satartia, Mississippi? The pipeline companies know, we know what happened in Satartia, Mississippi. They don't want to talk about it. In February 22, in the year 2022, after heavy raids, a mudslide called a welding failure. And it was 2020. 49 people were hospitalized, and it included all people within 1.5 miles of the rupture. And yet they're putting it as close as 200 feet. They say they aspire to put us within 1,000 feet of it. And yet in Satartia, we know that within 1.5 miles of the rupture, people were hospitalized. Some residents are still reporting long-term health effects even years after the accident. No one died, but only because they were a mile away. Satartia was a mile away from the rupture, unlike how close they want to put the pipeline here, including the Wolf pipeline for your populated areas. So they evacuated over 200 people, and that rupture blew a trench 40 feet deep filled with dry ice. So navigators say, oh, don't worry, we're putting 5 feet of cover over that pipeline. Well, if it blows a trench 40 feet deep, that is not going to protect you. That eruption, unlike the little test rupture that you just watched, continued for 4 hours in Satartia. So everything between the shutoff valves and down here, they want to use 20-mile shutoff valves, will erupt. And so Satartia, again, 4 hours, can you imagine? Gas-powered engines failed, and the Denbury plume model at that particular pipeline predicted that in the event of a rupture, the CO2 would never reach Satartia. So the Department of Transportation investigated and concluded that the current CO2 pipeline safety standards are inadequate and PHMSA must rewrite them, but they're not waiting. Here is a picture of that 40-foot trench filled with dry ice from the 2020 rupture in Satartia. And again, foaming at the mouth, first responders described scene after pipeline rupture and a gas leak. Also, some of those EMS workers were hospitalized. Some of them were crawling, trying to get to people to rescue them after their cars stalled out for lack of oxygen. So there's a federal regulatory vacuum. After investigating the Satartia rupture, the Pipeline Hazardous Materials Safety Administration, PHMSA, concluded that current regulations are inadequate to protect human safety. So we know this. This is not just our opinion. We need safe setbacks, which they do not want to give us. We need accurate plume models. Navigator has marked their plume models confidential. We're not allowed to discuss them. How can that be for a matter of public safety? And the new CO2 pipeline safety guidelines are scheduled for release October 24, and we need a moratorium until these new PHMSA safety guidelines are issued and until we have adequate setbacks. What's happening right now is unacceptable. So thank you for listening.
So let's talk a little bit about tile in the fields. The majority of the fields that I would assume Wolf wants to cross, that Navigator wants to cross, are flat pattern tiled fields. This is a picture of us installing tile just a few weeks ago in a field right next to where the proposed pipeline path is. And what we're doing here is we're putting 4-inch corrugated tile into the ground to drain the soil. We do this to keep the amount of water in the top of the soil down so the crops don't get drowned out. Whenever there's a heavy rain or too much precipitation, we don't want the crops to drown out. So we put this 4-inch tile in the ground. It's on 40-foot centers. And this is what it looks like after we install it. Here's a picture of the field then. This is a field that's had 40-foot laterals laid on it. These laterals are usually between 30 and 36 inches deep. We don't want to go too deep because we want to leave moisture down below the ground, below the 30-inch level. We want to leave moisture down there for the crop to grow. This is what a pattern tiled field looks like. So when we get done tiling the fields in, we have all these tile there. Most of them are laid on about a 2/10 grade per 100 feet. So that's not a lot of slope, and it's pretty exact. So here's a picture of a field that we tiled just this past fall. This is an 80-acre field. and when I get done here, I have a picture. I just got a new packet from Navigator this week. I have a picture of the way they want to go diagonally across a field like this. So imagine a pipeline 5 feet deep in the ground. They're going to come in and clear topsoil 125 feet wide, so they have a working an area to work in, and going diagonally across that field. I estimate there's between 40 and 50 tile lines they're going to cut. On the average, we have about I think about 120 or 130 tile lines in an 80-acre field on the average. Some are more complex than others, but this is what a tile map looks like then that we use to drain our fields with. So it's well known that when pipeline companies come in to work on tile, or when they come in to work and install pipelines, they don't care what the weather is. If the crew is there, they're going to work. And this is you can see the tile up on top of the ground here. This is an area in a field that was cleared. They were working on it, got heavy rainfall, and this is what it looks like. So I have trouble envisioning what it would look like to try to reinstall tile in a wet, muddy mess like that. So after the tile are put in the ground then, I assume ADM will offer some compensation for a couple of years, just like Navigator is. So this is a picture of a tile line 2 years. This is a picture of a pipeline 2 years after it went across the field. And obviously it's quite evident there. And you can see with the yellow diagonal strip across the field, there's a significant crop yield impact there. I'm not sure, but I would estimate that would be like a 30 or 40% loss of crop. So, and it doesn't just stop there. So here, straight through the middle of this photo here, this is a pipeline that was put in 8 years ago. And you can still see where the pipeline went through. It's really hard to ever return the soil. When you scrape away topsoil, compact subsoil, it's just really hard to return the soil to its natural flow, because when you compact that subsoil, freezing never goes deep enough. You can't run tillage tools deep enough. And that ground below there that the heavy equipment ran on has just compacted things so much that water will not penetrate it. Roots from corn and soybeans will not penetrate it. And it'll just be impossible for crops to grow back to their natural way. So talking about tile for a minute, and I just spoke with a land agent today, and we had a really interesting conversation, because I asked him, I said, so what's your plan to reinstall tile lines? And the fact of the matter is, at least with Navigator, there is no plan. They said, well, we're going to find local contractors that want to come in and do this. Well, I'm not sure I've got any local contractors next to me that want to come in and repair the damage in a field like this. And then the land agent also told me, he says, and oh, what you'll have to do is wherever the pipeline goes through the field, you'll have to put in new laterals and reattach all the, you'll have to put in new mains and reattach all the laterals to the mains end to get it to drain, and find some way to drain that out of the field. And some of these fields that they want to cross of ours, I can see that the angle they want to cross that, it would be impossible to put a lateral, put a main tile line in next to the pipeline to pick up the laterals and have the correct slope to get the field drained out. They also told me that so when they come into work, you know, the permanent easement they're asking for is 50 feet wide when they come in to work. The temporary easement then is another 75 feet. So they're gonna clear out and be working on a 125-foot wide swath through the field. Usually they take the topsoil down about 24 inches. So you can imagine what it's like when that much topsoil is removed, what they're doing compacting the subsoil then. So there are some studies that have been done. Here's one by Iowa State that shows because corn yields were reduced, an average of 25 for soybeans and an average of 15 for corn during the first and second crop seasons. I think there's some of these fields. We have a natural gas pipeline that was put in 55 years ago in one of our farms, and I can still see the diagonal line across the field from where it was put in, we're still dealing with compaction from when it was done. So a lot of land impact, and when land is bringing the kind of values it is right now, if you're a farmer, you need to be really concerned. I would also encourage you, you know, you're going to get, so this is what, that's not a very good picture, but there's a, yeah, there's the pipeline going across the field at a diagonal. So that's what it looks like when you get your offer from the pipeline company. And you'll also receive a page like this that has the compensation package in it. Take a really good look at it. And I would suggest that no one sign anything without talking to their attorney. There was 3 separate contracts in the packet we got from Navigator, and nothing in the contracts was written in the favor of the farmer. So if you want to try and negotiate, I would suggest, well, first of all, I would suggest not negotiating. I'm not sure we need the pipeline, and I don't want it crossing my prime farmland. But if you do, if it does come to the point where we need to band together and seek some very good legal representation. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. That was really helpful. I live in the city of Peoria. Good evening, everyone. I'm Joyce Blumenshine. I'm a volunteer with several local environmental groups. I've lived here 40 years and worked on clean air, clean water, and environmental health. And I'm very concerned about this pipeline. Concern for the urban areas is kind of really major. We ought to really focus on that just for a moment. Certainly the longest link of the pipeline is for our rural farm areas, our farm families, their communities. But for Peoria, with an estimated 2021 population of over about 112,000, that's a really big concern. And earlier this session tonight, Lan mentioned high consequence areas. That's a actual pipeline safety regulation definition. It's pretty cold sounding to me. It talks about it's an area where pipeline releases could have greater consequences to health and safety or the environment. But hey, there's no specific guidelines for that or no requirements. There's general kind of a modeling. It's really disconcerting when you start looking at the lack of regulations, which will be talked about later. So you've already seen the map on the left and the lateral going into Peoria. We do not know the exact route into Peoria. We don't know if it will go through all of Bartonville, a town just immediately south of Peoria. We don't know the exact route, but the way it looks here, it will come up along our historic river corridor of industrial areas, and that's on the riverside. Exactly across from that are neighborhoods, communities of high density where people live in what are now called environmental justice areas. By the federal and state environmental justice determination, these are areas composed predominantly of people of color, or the community has low income concerns, or both, and that is very true for the area you see here in red. The blue X is the expected endpoint of this Wolf ADM Mt.Simon hub pipeline. Now in that area, the blue X is in the 61602 zip code. That's immediately around there, and to the right, the 61605, one of our very poorest areas, is to above it, and to the left. Those areas are over 80% minority, over 90% poverty level, and in 2021, a family of 3 at poverty level makes barely over $21,000 a year. So these communities are already suffering. They have historic records of pollution and the health consequences and other problems that are associated with that. The next map is a little more detailed. The red dot is the expected endpoint of the pipeline. There is a yellow line going up, and that is a Google Map mile. If you look at the end, there's a public school. There's 2 stars, veterans home, public library to the right, public housing. Up further is our public baseball diamond. So if you make an arc with that yellow line, you can see that area clearly is inhabited by many people, their homes, communities, and it also has many public buildings. There's over 5,000 people in the immediate 1 mile area. by the US EPA Eco Environmental Compliance guidelines. And so looking closer here, every one of these little yellow boxes is a church, a school, a public building, a park. And again, the proximity to that blue X is a major concern. So thank you all for being here. Much more information to come, and I'll stop my screen share now.
Thank you, Joyce. My name is Pam Richard, and I too am with the Eco Justice Collaborative. And I'm here to talk with you a little bit about understanding the role the Illinois Commerce Commission plays in the approval of a pipeline project like ADM Wolf is proposing. And to talk about why you need to intervene. So going back a little bit, this is a law that's on the books that regulates carbon dioxide pipelines, and it's called the Carbon Dioxide Transportation and Sequestration Act. It was put in place in 2011 for FutureGen, and many of you on this call, I bet, remember FutureGen. That was a research and development project that was sorely sought after by the state of Illinois. To show how carbon could be captured from a coal plant and then stored underground. This bill was written to accommodate a 40-mile-long pipeline transporting CO2 to the storage area. The project was never built after 11 years because of cost overruns, schedules that weren't being met, technological problems, etc. And to my knowledge, there was never another CO2 pipeline project proposed. So the primary takeaway on this slide is to lay the groundwork by saying we're working with a bill that was developed for one project and a very short pipeline. I'm going to go a bit on a limb here and say I'm guessing that neither the General Assembly nor the Illinois Commerce Commission thought that we would be in the current mad dash to build pipelines for sequestration projects. And I think somebody needs to take a pause and look at what we can do to fix this bill. So I'm going to go through some of the things that are unique and problematic before I talk about the process. There are a few key problems with the legislative purpose. I've highlighted one of those in yellow here. The CO2 pipelines are declared to be in the public interest before anybody even comes to propose a project. In other words, the purpose of a need for any CO2 pipeline anywhere has already been decided, and no one has to prove purpose and need. Not even the developer. And the second problem here with this legislative purpose is the act, as I said before, was drafted at a time when legislators thought capturing CO2 from a coal plant was going to allow us to use Illinois coal, thereby providing an economic benefit. And you can see here, they talk about Illinois coal, they talk about energy security, etc. And these pipelines have nothing to do with energy, at least as they are not transporting a source of energy. They're transporting CO2, a waste product. So the bill is clearly outdated and needs some updating. The process, the first thing to know, and I think this is interesting, I never knew this, is that the Illinois Commerce Commission runs its review and approval process pretty much like a trial. And someone said to me, it's like a trial without the black robes, like the judge doesn't come in wearing robes. But other than that, it includes a judge, it includes 5 commissioners who act as a jury, and those commissioners are appointed by the governor. They're the ones that are going to make the final decision. And they're going to do that based on staff input after staff takes into consideration all of the expert witnesses, all of the staff, all the things that happen that are submitted to do this case. So there will be testimony from the applicant. There'll be testimony from the interveners. There's going to be testimony by expert witnesses. There'll be lots of memos, lots of staff reports, and live cross-examinations, and there will be briefs. All of this takes place in 11 months. And actually, much of that is front loaded onto the first half of that 11-month process. So there are some limitations here, and I want to call these out because I think it's important to know as you think about intervening, which we're going to ask you to do if you're involved here, that there are some things that you need to be aware of. No public information meetings are required. Unless someone here on this webinar can say otherwise, in Illinois, ADM has not held any public information meetings. They are not required. ADM is not required to provide maps until they file with the ICC. And that's why no one, or at least as I think, no one that I know has heard anything about Wolf ADM that can really be used to understand the full impacts of their project. We're just trying to look at this from a broad-based, a large map with a line painted across it. That's a big problem. Second problem, you have to pay to play. The ICC will not take anything into their official record unless one officially intervenes in the process. I want to underscore that as a municipality, as a township, as a citizen, you have to be intervening or they will not include anything that you say. None of your concerns will be entered into the official record. And what does that mean? That means you have to hire an attorney. The Act limits the analysis of the impacts of a CO2 pipeline on the economy, infrastructure, and public safety as presented by affected local governments. And that's pretty broad. We've been finding as we've been intervening with the Navigator project, we can get a lot of information in there. But you have to be representing a local unit of government to prevent that evidence. Property values are taken into consideration, but not as they relate to eminent domain. In other words, the ICC will not negotiate fair market value of properties that might be acquired with eminent domain. And speaking of eminent domain, the ICC grants authority to the pipeline developer to acquire property by eminent domain when they find that the pipeline project meets all of the criteria in this act. A pipeline developer does have to show that he or she has negotiated in good faith, but Wolf ADM could receive approval without obtaining any signed agreements. In other words, there's no percentages that say you have to have 50% of the people along the route before you can actually get eminent domain approval. That does not exist. And finally, this process allows a pipeline developer to proceed with eminent domain before having all of the requisite approvals from federal and state agencies. This includes PHMSA, as discussed by Lan and by Kathy, who regulates the safety aspects of the pipeline. But it also includes the Army Corps of Engineers, who will look at impacts to wetlands, stream crossings, threatened and endangered species, historic and cultural resources, and impacts to public lands. And a pipeline developer has to obtain approval from the Illinois Department of Agriculture. So while construction can't take place without all of those approvals, eminent domain can. This is an interesting point to me because the 2011 Act limits right-of-way width to 200 feet. So ADM could propose a 200-foot wide corridor, understanding that within that 200 feet, there would be some flexibility to ensure that it was avoiding hazards or slopes or whatever within that 200 feet band. But as you may know, Wolf ADM is proposing a 2-mile wide corridor, in part because they are hoping to avoid taking property from a landowner who doesn't want their property affected. But what will the ICC do about that dilemma? I'm not sure, and I think all we have to do is sit back and wait and see. So the ICC is supposed to look at these other things too, and they're supposed to look at the evidence from the Department of Economic Opportunity, Commerce and Opportunity, Department of Commerce and Economic Opportunity, let me say that correctly, regarding its ability to attract economic growth, meet future energy needs, and comply with environmental requirements. And it's also supposed to be looking at evidence from state or federal entities regarding the effect on security and stability and reliability of energy. And the problem with those last two paragraphs is that they're focused on economic development and energy. There is little economic development associated with the CO2 pipeline. It's just a handful of jobs. And this pipeline, all CO2 pipelines, carry a waste stream rather than a source of energy. So this is another place where this act is outdated. They will look at whether the application was filed properly, whether the applicant is fit and able to carry out the project, whether the applicant has an agreement with a source of CO2 emissions. And as you know, ADM is bringing their industrial sources from Iowa and in Illinois to sequester their carbon in Macon County. The applicant also has to demonstrate they have the necessary financial, managerial, legal, and technical ability to do all that work and be approved. So a couple things for tonight. What does all this have to do with you? Well, Steve said this before, and I'm going to say it again, and I'm probably going to say it again before I'm finished talking. If you are a landowner, either along the pipeline route or in the sequestration area, do not sign an easement. Let me repeat that. Do not sign a voluntary easement with ADM. There will be time for that if the project is approved and Wolf ADM does receive approval for eminent domain. And one of the reasons why, and this is something that you need to know, Navigator has been increasing prices from landowners in some of the counties along the route. And they've done this about 3 times. So landowners who sell now will lock themselves into lower prices that are non-negotiable. So it's better to wait. And it's better than to do, as Steve said, to work with an attorney to share costs and get the best deal you can, not just financially, but putting other things into that agreement that would benefit all who are impacted by the project. Second, you must intervene in the ICC proceedings. That is the only way to get your concerns and your voice heard. And it can influence the outcome, whether you're a local unit of government or a landowner. We're going to talk about what to do if you're a landowner in a minute. And remember, you can send the ICC all of the correspondence you want. You can make all the emails, all the phone calls you want, but none of that will make its way into the official record. You have to intervene. So one of the things that we have found that has made our team successful in where we are today is we have organized, and we put landowners into positions where they can feel comfortable talking to their county officials, their city councils, their townships, and ask them to please help them stop this pipeline and do so by intervening. So we identified landowners early on. We are still holding weekly Zoom meetings. We help provide folks like you the tools that they need to talk to their representatives, the townships, the city councils, and county boards. They have gone to all those meetings, made public comments, and they have asked their boards and their city councils and their township boards, supervisors to adopt resolutions, moratoriums, and to intervene in the ICC proceedings. The end goal, educate people, ask them to take action, and that end action needs to be intervening. So this is the snapshot that currently shows the success we've had with that approach. You can see the resolutions and the moratoriums, and the petitioners on the right include five counties and Citizens Against Heartland Greenway Pipeline. So we had the capacity to only work in 6 counties. Maybe because Navigator is refiling, we'll be able to expand that. But that still was enough to get the information across to the ICC that needed to be heard. But we want landowner intervention too. And so this is how you can intervene. What we did is we worked together with those landowners to create a board and a nonprofit that is called Citizens Against Heartland Greenway Pipeline. And that process, that establishing the nonprofit, allowed impacted landowners not only to intervene, but also to collect fees to pay for group representation. So intervening at the ICC can cost anywhere between $150,000 to $200,000. That's a lot of money. And I would bet that anybody sitting here listening to us tonight is going to say, boy, that's going to make me back away. But what we did, because we had built through organizing a substantial list of landowners interested in participating in group representation, we were able to limit that cost to just $500. So I want to say we have the tools to help you do that. We can help you form that nonprofit with bylaws, articles of incorporation, etc. And we found $500 spread across 160 landowners or so, paid for on an annual basis, is enough money to do what you need to do. So now I'm going to end by saying that organizing is a key way to stop wolf ADM, just as it has been for Navigator. And I want to make sure that you hear before you leave tonight that all that organizing has prevented Navigator from getting the majority of the easements that they need to move their project forward. After a full year, they have just 6% of the total easements that they need to build their project. So I'm going to say again, do not sign a voluntary easement with ADM Wolf. And a few weeks ago, you may know, Navigator withdrew their application before the ICC. Again, organizing by landowners in the planned sequestration area has kept Navigator from getting the lease agreements that they need to store their carbon. So they can't do it. Nobody signed the easements. And without a sequestration site, Navigator doesn't have a route. Without a route, intervening governments and citizens can't evaluate the project. So the interveners, including the citizens group, Citizens Against Heartland Greenway Pipeline, piled on, filing motions to dismiss the project. And finally, staff suggested that Navigator finally withdraw their application, which they did. And they will be back, but we're considering this to be a temporary victory. Now, Navigator is taking a proposed development agreement to McDonough County, one of the counties on the route who intervened. They're offering the county board up to $630,000 per year for 30 years, not only to drop their opposition, but also to help them facilitate development of their pipeline. So county residents are again organizing. They're there tonight as this development agreement is being discussed, and we believe the county board will listen once again to its constituents who do not want eminent domain. They do not want a hazardous pipeline with all the safety risks in their county next to where they live and where they work. So in closing, all of us are inviting you to work with the Coalition to Stop CO2 Pipelines and take advantage of all the resources we put together and what we've learned. So you can go to our website and see what the resources that we have, download resolutions, sample resolutions, download the kind of resources you need as fact sheets, etc. All this is without cost. And you'll receive an email from us with a copy of this webinar with a list of resources that you can look at and take advantage of. So remember these things. Do not sign a voluntary easement. You got to intervene and do that with group representation. And counties and city councils can do that too. That's what happened with the Navigator project. You have to organize and put pressure on all of the local units of government so that they agree to, in fact, intervene. Their voices need to be at the table. And remember, we're here to help. And so with that, I thank you, and I'll turn it back to Ann for questions and answers.
Thanks so much, Pam, and thank you to all the panelists for those great presentations. Like Pam said, we're going to move to question and answers now. So anyone, any question, please feel free to type it in the Q&A section and we'll go through these. I saw some folks had asked a question about whether these slides will be available. And yes, we will be, we will share the presentations when we share the video. And so that was one question that's answered. And then Holly had asked, I live in the Quad Cities, so I'm interested in where the lines are on the Iowa side of the Mississippi. I don't know if we have a.
I think
Yeah.
Pam had a map in her presentation.
Yeah, I will try to share my screen and find that map. I'm having a horrible time tonight. Okay, let me look. Here you go. How about that map? Does that work?
Was
I
it?
think it comes down from Cedar Rapids and then it goes over and it goes up to Clinton in Iowa and then it will cross over and into, right now there's only those two. Isn't that right, folks on the team here for the?
Yes.
That's what we understand.
Hope that helps. And that also shows the fact that we really don't have detailed maps. This is all we know at this time, is what we're looking at in maps of this scale.
Awesome. Thank you, Pam and everybody. A question from Crystal. Thank you for talking about how the construction of the pipeline affects fields and crop yields. Can you please also talk about the effects of leakage or a spill or burst occurring on farmland?
If that question is mine as a farmer, I would think it would be like a big frost area. You heard the comments about how cold it is. It's pumped under pressure and it's extremely cold. And as it spreads out, it would just be a quick kill frost across all the ground that it covers then.
Yeah, you might consider livestock as well. They're going to be asphyxiated just like humans. Also, the force, there's going to be a debris field, a little 40-foot trench. That's pretty powerful. That's going to be ripping up a lot of ground right there and dropping it. And also, you're going to have some wind force with it, too. Down in Satoshi, they said that this sounded like an airplane engine. And I'm an audiologist by training. That's usually around 140 dB. You're dealing with a lot of force and a lot of cold and a debris field. And also dry ice, by the way. That 40-foot trench was full of dry ice, and that is also vaporized. So yeah, you're dealing with frostbite. And that's according to the CDC guidelines as well.
Thanks,
And
Steve.
I would like to also point out that when you sign, if you were to sign an easement, that is a permanent easement that you're signing away with your property. You're giving them permission forever that is their property to come in on any time they need to or want to. And they say they'll offer compensation, but they could come in on that field, on that strip of ground that they have purchased for eternity. You don't get it back.
And also on some of the temporary easements, because that was one of the things they were looking at for my property, my very own backyard at one point, to park their heavy equipment. And that is also going to compact and destroy land. They have to have some place to park all this heavy equipment, and that can also be very damaging.
Also, when you look at the proposed maps, they have little yellow boxes. I doubt if my picture didn't show very good, but they have little yellow boxes drawn in next to the roads and things because they have to have extra area then to drill underneath the road right of ways. So that's another consideration too, is that they're gonna dig holes in the ground, big enough holes to put the boring equipment in to drill underneath the roads every time they cross a road or go under a river.
Thanks, Kathy and Steve. Yes, definitely. We've heard from road commissioners of townships in lots of areas that that's really a primary concern, drilling under the roads. Catherine had asked a question about have city councils in Peoria and Quad Cities agreed to intervene? And Joyce, I see you might be able to answer this?
Yeah. Hey, thanks, Ann. Thank you, Catherine. That's a great question. Certainly the hope might be that, but what this is really new. And so so I want to thank the City of Peoria has an interest from their staff and appreciate their looking at this. Also, we have folks in Rock Island County who've reached out, but right now we don't have enough information. We do really hope that that will happen, but and we're trying to get the word out more. So as Pam said, organize. We really need to reach out to all of our council members and all the cities and towns along here, and for folks listening tonight. And that's certainly something that really needs to happen, because this is coming our way, as you can't stop it, as Lan said, and it needs to happen. So we hope to get more information out and talk to individuals soon. Thank you.
I'd also like to comment a little bit. Down here, again, they filed quickly. We didn't expect them to file that quickly. But so we had to scramble a little bit. But one thing you can do right now is start talking to your townships, give them information so that you are ready to go. Again, changing hearts and minds. It's a matter of educating people. And we got every single township in Sangamon County along the pipeline to sign a resolution opposing this pipeline. That was very powerful when you go to the county level and you say your townships along the pipeline don't want this. And then we started working with Sangamon County, who was extremely receptive for information. And then they agreed to intervene. Also, again, I'm Vice President of Citizens Against the Heartland Greenway Pipeline. We went to the counties and started educating them. It's not too early to start educating, even though we don't have the details. We know that these pipelines are dangerous and what some of those dangers are. So start educating, and then they also kind of joined forces with us so that we had some shared legal costs, which saved us some money in intervening at the ICC. So we've kind of done this before now in Illinois. We were kind of the first out. But we'd be happy to help and advise, and Joyce will be a wonderful advisor for you as well. So yeah, but it's not too early to get out and start educating people. And by the way, there's a question there too about the pipeline diameter. That's true, but you want to look at the full cylindrical volume. The volume of the eruption will be from shutoff valve to shutoff valve. And the rupture video that Lan showed you was for a very short distance and an 8-inch pipeline. So it's pi r squared times height or length in this case to compute cylindrical volume. So that's pretty straightforward. You can pull that up with a little calculator. But you also have to consider pressure for one thing. So, but we computed out that the sitar shear rupture compared to that test rupture video we saw is probably 29 times as powerful. And then down here where they have 20-mile shutoff valves with a 20-inch pipeline, approximately 1.45 that. We couldn't take pressure into account because it's hard to compare pressures. So there's some other variables in there. But based on cylindrical volume, you saw that rupture video of the asphyxiant cloud, much, much more powerful for what they're dealing with. So thanks for the question on diameter, but diameter is certainly one driver, but it's one of several. The distance between shutoff valves is also a main driver.
Thanks, Kathy.
Mm-hmm.
Good question from Mary here. For folks that might not be familiar with ADM, I think I know what it stands for, but would someone want to give someone feel able to answer that?
Archer, Daniels, Midland. I think Lan and I live about 30 miles or so from one of their major facilities. I'm not sure it's their headquarters. I should know that, in Decatur. So they are the world's largest, I think, company that is producing products from corn and other grains. So they're huge. Huge.
Thanks, Pam. Next question, is the pipeline proposal crossing through Henry County?
Just a quick comment. The mapping is not really very good, but it does look like it could clip a corner of Henry County, same for Stark. And again, when you go farther southeast, McLean and some of those counties, and it's really hard to tell, but certainly that we've got to be aware of that. Please, folks out in Henry County, be alert. Same for Stark and other counties all along the route. Thanks.
Thanks, Joyce. Question from Jack. Outside of construction issues on farmland and possible disasters, what do the lasting environmental issues look like for these pipelines?
I can share a little bit. Obviously, we've talked about some of the health and safety impacts, but in terms of other environmental impacts, there are, because this is a corridor and it has to cross many different landforms. One of the things that the folks who are developing pipelines do need to do is get a permit from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and coordinate with the Fish and Wildlife Service, IDNR, et cetera. Anytime that they cross through wetlands or streams or other habitat of value, that those have to be considered. If you're clearing forest, that's a fairly long-term impact and an impact on wildlife corridors, especially as you're crossing streams. Most of the time, the pipeline companies, the construction companies, use what's called directional drilling, where they can to essentially go underground and go under these kind of resources. But where you have broad areas, such as along river corridors, it's much more difficult to do that, I believe. And even high directional drilling has some side impacts with runoff from the material that's coming out of the borehole and the auger hole. So that's one element of environmental impact that isn't generally raised up.
Thanks, Lan. And we have two questions that kind of are related and bring up another environmental impact related to sequestration. We had someone ask, you've been talking a lot about pipelines. Can you speak about sequestration wells? And then Patrick asked, what is the rough estimate of the percentage of the total carbon produced in the US by industry that this pipeline will sequester? So kind of a few questions asking about what are some of the impacts on the sequestration part of this.
So I can take part of that. The percentage, though, I want to throw to Lan because all right, let me just let you say it because I might not be remembering it correctly.
My understanding in terms of the total carbon emissions for the US annually compared to the total emissions from ethanol plants, the ethanol contributes at less than 1%. So we're spending a lot of effort to go after a very, very small portion of the CO2 emissions. Long term, I think the intention is, the vision is that we'll be able to connect a pipe to everything that shoots out CO2, and so the major, industries and power plants, et cetera, would be doing that. That's a long way off, and the technology, frankly, isn't there. The power plant industry, larger industry, carbon capture has been a dismal failure so far. I guess it depends on whether you call it a glass half full or glass half empty, but it's not ready for prime time now. They've tried this and have been working at it for decades and billions of dollars invested, and the percentage of capture is still relatively disappointing. So we're going after the little stuff now and building a lot of infrastructure in hopes that perhaps someday it'll be more impactful.
Thank you, Lan. And with respect to sequestration, this is something I could talk about all night. So I'm going to try and make it brief and see what other questions you have. It's a big deal in many folks' view. At the scale we're talking about, there are concerns about being able to safely sequester carbon for eternity, right? Without having it escape. So some of the concerns are related to how the act of sequestering actually requires one to do borehole drilling of cap rock and to kind of do the exploration and the mapping, et cetera, which then can create pathways for escaping. The gas can escape. Simply putting in injection wells, and I know in the Montgomery County area where Navigator is now looking at the possibility of sequestering there, they're proposing seven injection wells and a whole host of other monitoring wells at varying depths, et cetera, to go along with it. And those wells are a pathway again for potential CO2 leakage. We need to be thinking about this as keeping the CO2 underground permanently sequestered for 100 years before it turns into a state that doesn't allow it to be migrating. When you put it in the ground via ejection well, you actually are displacing the existing saline brine that exists in the pore space. And the act of injection and displacement causes the CO2 to move around and to move up and move laterally. There are concerns related to what happens if it goes laterally. And I didn't sign an easement, but now it's under my ground. And now if it happens to escape, who's liable? There are concerns related to who's going to be liable long-term when corporations come and go. There are concerns about potential contamination of water. If the CO2 escapes either via the injection wells, the monitoring wells, or unmapped faults or cracks in the cap rock, or potentially through induced seismic activity when the pressure gets too high, if it's not properly controlled, there could be earthquakes that would again break the cap seal. And if it goes into the water sources, CO2, as I think Lane said earlier, when combined with water, forms carbonic acid, and that again can release from the rocks the toxicities and the heavy metals that exist there. And I can go on and on and on. But I do want to close with this, because I think this is really important. Those of us who live in Illinois have been following ADM's success, and they have successfully sequestered 3.5 million metric tons of CO2 over 11 years. So they've done that, and that's to be lifted up. But what we're looking at here with ADM Wolf alone is 12 million metric tons a year. So that is not at all comparable to what ADM has done to date. If you add Navigator to that, now we're looking at 27 million metric tons a year. So the scales are not comparable. And the last thing I want to say about scale is that the University of Illinois Prairie Research Institute is partnering with the federal government to study how to safely sequester carbon in an area that is near Decatur. It's a little bit south, and it includes part of Christian County in addition to Macon County. And that project is looking at how to project capacity, because capacity is related to the ability to store it safely without a lot of pressure that causes problems. And they are looking at that project and to determine if they can do a sequestering of 50 million metric tons of carbon over 30 years. I think it's 30 years, right? So they're still studying it at this commercial scale. So many of us who are looking at these projects are looking at both pipeline hazards and the ability to sequester carbon safely so that it doesn't contaminate people's water, it doesn't contaminate people's land, it doesn't cause more problems than if we'd done nothing at all. So that's what I would say to that.
Also, the ADM project just has 1 mile of pipeline. It really does not give us any reassurance about the pipelines, which may be the most dangerous part of the whole project. They're both very dangerous.
Thanks, Kathy and Pam. And Lan, I see that you are able to answer this live. We have a question from Jim. Can we do a simulation of a broken CO2 pipeline utilizing EMT in small town groups? And then suggesting perhaps to take some video and perhaps do some sort of report.
Okay, I'm not sure I clicked on that. I would answer. Can I ask for a clarification of the question? Can we do a simulation of a broken CO2 pipeline utilizing EMT in small town groups? You mean an emergency preparedness exercise? Is that, I think that's okay. Take videos and pics with a small report and publish on YouTube. That would be an interesting thing to do. Yeah, I think it would be a challenge for many, for any community. Do we have a volunteer? Somebody, I mean, I think that's something that every community should step back and say, how would we react? Are we prepared, and what would we do, especially in the unique circumstances where it's an asphyxiant, and frankly, we don't have good models to say how far it would spread, but we do know from Satartia that it can spread a good distance. So I think it's a great idea, Jim.
Yeah, and start with only all electric vehicles will work, and see how far you get with your EMT.
I think that brings up an important point that maybe we didn't emphasize enough, because there will be costs if this pipeline goes forward. There will be costs to your communities and your counties, right? So and I think that everybody needs to go into that with eyes wide open. ADM Wolf will not be required, as Navigator has not been required yet, at least, to be able to pay for some of that emergency equipment that Kathy talked about we all need. You know, you need air supply respirators, you need the kind of vehicles that are electrified, right? A whole host of things. There's going to be impacts to your roads. I do think the federal government does require the applicant to do some emergency planning with local communities, but I don't think it's nearly enough in terms of what needs to be done. And of course, they are not going to be highlighting the kinds of impacts at the extent we've been talking about them tonight. And so that's one reason why, to prepare your emergency, first responders, if they have this kind of understanding and ability to then ask the right questions, I think that will help everybody communicate better. So again, a lot of that information can be, obtained from our website. We continually put resources up on a frequent basis, and I just encourage you to take a look at that.
And also, when you talk to EMS, also talk to your emergency rooms. If the EMS could transport them expeditiously, are they prepared to deal with a couple hundred people at once with asphyxia, possible frostbite, and the other effects that go with it?
Thanks, everyone. And just doing a quick time check. I think we have time for a few more questions, and then we'll probably wrap up. And before we go, we want to make sure we leave you with some next steps and what we, invite you to join us and work moving forward. Had a question from Crystal. I was told that the sequestration wells can often have radioactive saline in them that must be ejected to inject carbon. Can you please talk about what radioactive saline is? And Pam, I see you nodding, so I will.
Yeah. Actually, I would call it brine. I think that what happens, Crystal, what happens is when they put CO2 into the ground via injection, it displaces that brine and it causes pressure. And so one way of managing pressure is to extract the brine which depending upon where it is, it can be radioactive. And given what I've read about our rock formations, here in central Illinois, I would expect that they would, and I'm not a scientist, but I would expect that they could and probably do have a low level of radioactivity. So what then you do, now you have one waste product you're putting in the ground, and now you're extracting another waste product that you have to do something with. So probably you're going to put it in the ground again somewhere. So we're creating this circular system of problems, I think, that don't have solutions that we really have thought through. And I know that the scientists who are promoting this, we're going to say, yes, we have thought that through, and no, we know we can inject the brine solution, whether it's low radioactivity levels or not. We're going to put it back in the ground and we can safely do that. But I don't know. I mean, it's like, this is something that I think is a pretty risky experiment, because it's not been done at this scale. And we're looking at a technology that is heavily funded. Everybody wants to do it. And we don't have the pause button isn't there to make sure we can all do it safely.
Thanks, Pam. And looks like this might be one of our last questions. If these pipelines do continue to expand through our communities, if you guys could all be on the planning commission for one of these projects, what would you like to be seen? What would you like to see be done differently?
Okay, I'm going to start. First of all, we need setbacks so that no one is exposed to over 5,000 parts per million in the event of a rupture. And they need to guarantee that. They keep saying, well, Satartia was a one-off, or it's not a good model. We really don't know. Nonsense. In the chat or the question, somebody brought up Cameroon. Well, that was a huge volume that killed 1745, over 1,000 people, 1,745 and 3,500 livestock. So that was a huge rupture volume, but it's still instructive into the toxicity of this. From the volcanology literature, we know a lot about CO2 exposure because the volcanologists get exposed to it for CO2. From CDC, they have guidelines because they know what happens with CO2 in a closed environment. And they rewrote some of the guidelines for the beer industry for CO2 exposure in a enclosed environment. So here's what we do know, and these are guidelines that I think we should be holding them to. At 40,000 parts per million exposure, that is immediately dangerous to life and health. At 30,000 parts per million exposure, and they should be able to run this from their plume models, that is a 15-minute exposure limit. And keep in mind that the rupture in Satartia was 4 hours. So we need to hold them to guaranteeing that the setbacks are far enough away that no one will be exposed to certainly immediately dangerous to life and health, certainly not to a STEL level, which is a 15-minute exposure. And the 5,000 parts per million is the limit for an 8-hour exposure, which is what we would expect from one of these large ruptures, because that rupture is going to continue. So we need them to have setbacks with documented exposure limits that do not exceed 5,000 parts per million.
I'm going to just piggyback on that because Kathy and I did work with a local attorney out of Bloomington, Illinois, with offices, actually the headquarters are in Chicago, and municipalities and counties can actually zone CO2 pipelines. You can do that, and you can establish setbacks. A couple things that I think are worth noting. Number one, there's no guarantee that the Illinois Commerce Commission might preempt or your setbacks. They might not, but they might, and so that you have to go into that with eyes wide open. Two, what we proposed, which I think is a sound way to go about it, is setting a standard that's a mile or more to begin with, and then through a variance process, allowing the developer to show by using computer modeling, the computer dispersion modeling that we've been talking about, that they can actually safely put this pipeline in closer than that distance. But at least you have something to do to start with. And third, I think if you didn't hear me sort of suggesting this in my presentation, I think we got to get the state to start working on this. It's time for the state to get involved and protect the citizens and residents of Illinois. And it's time to look at solutions that don't go forward without a purpose and need, that don't automatically give a developer eminent domain authority without having landowners say at all, without having safe setbacks, without having the emergency preparedness and backup funding we need that people have been raising tonight, and so forth. So I think we need to be moving to that place. But in the meantime, you can all adopt a moratorium, which will keep and that was substantiated by the attorneys, and we have a white paper that they prepared that will in fact help you know what they looked at in terms of legal basis to say municipality and a county can adopt a moratorium that is tied to the PHMSA rulemaking process. So it could be 2 years or until PHMSA completes its rulemaking process, whichever comes first. PHMSA is expected to complete their process, they say, in October 2024. Maybe it'll go longer and you'll have to renew your moratorium, but that would be up to you. But you can do that.
Thanks, Pam. And then 2 final questions. One is just clarification. Michael asked, Pam, did you say only 3.1 million metric tons in the last 11 years that ADM has sequestered? Yes. Okay.
No, 3.5. 3.5.
3.5. Awesome. And then final question. Joyce had asked, is anything happening at the state legislative level to look at the current CO2 issues?
Oh, not this Joyce asked that?
Joyce R.
Okay, so Joyce, there are a group of us who are beginning to do just that. And that's all I can say tonight, but stay tuned.
Thanks, Pam. And thank you to all the panelists so much for putting together such informative presentations and for, answering questions and having this discussion. And thank you to all our attendees who have spent an hour and a half with us tonight. And if you can see the chat, I've put our coalition's website, which is No Illinois CO2, the number 2 pipelines.org. And on that website, there is a place where you can sign up to receive updates. And we would really appreciate if everyone would go to that website and sign up to get updates. We'd love to have you in our coalition to continue monitoring, these projects that are going to really impact our landscape and our environment. And we would really like landowners to contact us, and we can discuss how we can reach out to townships, road commissioners who are going to be dealing with road crossings and many other impacts. So we would really love to, interact with anyone who's interested in organizing. And as Pam said, we will be sending out this recorded webinar with the PowerPoints and with our contact info, so that anyone who wants to speak with us more would be happy to speak with you. And once again, thank you so much for joining us and for your attention and your great questions.